Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Why is it that African Americans particularly are left out of American history?
Well, I think that the answer to that question of why African Americans are left out of American history fits in a bigger scheme of what happens in education. In education, there has been in the last 50 years a real movement to just get God out of history books. We just leave him out. Well, as you look at elements where God has worked, even current polling today, and has for a number of years, shows that the most Christian community in America is the African American community. Higher percent of African Americans are Christians than any other group. So if you're going to talk about African American heroes, by and large, you're going to have to talk about some Christians, and since we don't talk about Christians in textbooks, African Americans really receive the brunt of that. It's pretty difficult to find many African American heroes that were not Christians. And so what happens now, and there's been another tendency in our textbooks. Tendency in our textbooks is when we show heroes, we like to show either victims or angry people.
Right.
We want to show people that were fighting the injustice of the system, that wicked government. We're going to show people who fought it, or we're going to show people who were victimized in some way. And there are plenty of those out there. But there's tons of inspirational stories. The Absalom Jones and the Richard Allens, and this is another great example. This right here is a document, original document signed by a judge. This is signed in 1814 by a judge named Wentworth Cheswell. And Wentworth Cheswell was a black judge in America in 1814. And by the way, he was elected to office in 1775 in New Hampshire. So here's a judge who's been elected to office for 40 years who's black American. We never hear about African Americans getting elected to office. We thought all that started with Barbara Jordan and Andrew Young back in the 70s. No. African Americans elected to office back in 1775, like Wentworth Cheswell. And interestingly, we don't know about this guy, but he's the guy who lined up with Paul Revere. And when Paul Revere went on his ride, Wentworth Cheswell went on his ride as well. Black and white going to warn Americans the British are coming. So we hear part of the story. We don't hear about Wentworth Cheswell.
In 1789, following the ratification of the Constitution, Congress expanded its fight to end slavery by passing the Northwest Ordinance. That law forbade slavery in any of the federal territories then held. And for this reason, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin all eventually came into the nation as free states. Some years later, in 1808, Congress continued its fight against slavery by abolishing the slave trade. A famous sermon commemorating the abolition of the slave trade was given by the Reverend Absalom Jones, the first black bishop of the Episcopal Church in America. His sermon was delivered in the famous St. Thomas's Church. Very few today know that in 1808 Congress abolished the slave trade, or that Bishop Absalom Jones delivered such a compelling sermon. Although slavery still had not been abolished in all the states, things definitely were moving in the right direction. Yet a major reversal was about to occur. By 1820, most of the Founding Fathers were dead, and Thomas Jefferson's party, the Democratic Party, had become the majority party in Congress. With this new party in charge, a change in congressional policy emerged. Recall that the 1789 law prohibited slavery in a federal territory. In 1820, the Democratic Congress passed the Missouri Compromise and reversed that earlier policy, permitting slavery in almost half of the federal territories. Several states were subsequently admitted as slave states, and for the first time since the Declaration of Independence in the Constitution, slavery was being officially promoted by congressional policy. Several other pro-slavery laws were also passed by Democrats in Congress, including the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. That law required Northerners to return escaped slaves back into slavery or else pay huge fines. In many instances, the law became little more than an excuse for Southern slave hunters to kidnap free blacks in the North and carry them into slavery in the South. Because the Fugitive Slave Law allowed free blacks to be carried into slavery, this law was disastrous for blacks in the North. And as a consequence of the atrocious provisions of this Democratic law, some 20,000 blacks in the North completely left the United States and fled to Canada. In fact, the Underground Railroad reached the height of its activity during this period, helping thousands of slaves escape from slavery in the South all the way into Canada simply to escape the reach of the Democrats' Fugitive Slave Law. In 1854, the Democratic-controlled Congress passed another law strengthening slavery, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. thus allowing slavery to be introduced into parts of the new territory where it previously had been forbidden, thereby increasing the national area in which slavery would be permitted. Following the passage of these pro-slavery laws in Congress, in May of 1854, a number of the anti-slavery Democrats in Congress, along with some anti-slavery members from other political parties, including the Whigs, Free Soilers, and Emancipationists, they formed a new political party to fight slavery and secure equal rights for black Americans. The name of that party? They called it the Republican Party. They called it that because they wanted to return to the principles of freedom and equality first set forth in the governing documents of the Republic before the pro-slavery members of Congress had perverted those original principles.
Let's go to the Battle of Yorktown, 1781. That final Battle of Yorktown, in our textbooks, they always show the young general, French general, Marquis de Lafayette, as being a real key to whipping the British, and that's no question about it. He was a real key. And standing right beside him, the pictures they show in the textbooks, is an African-American. Now, the African-American is James Armistead. Nobody ever talks about him. They just think he's holding the horse for, you know, he's a black, he has to be a slave. He's holding the horse for Lafayette, and that's the only reason he's there. No, he's there because those two guys together that brought an end to the American Revolution. Well, how so? Well, James Armistead was a double spy in the American Revolution.
Oh my goodness.
A great story. James Armistead, Virginia, he gets General Cornwallis, the British general, convinced that he's an escaped slave. Oh, I'm leaving these terrible Americans. I'm an escaped slave. Please take me in. You kind British, take me in. And so General takes him in. He starts serving the general, waiting on him, serving his table, serving his food. And he hears all this stuff that the British are doing, because Cornwallis is meeting with his generals, and he's getting all this information where the generals are about to move and what they're doing. What's he do? Well, he's feeding it back to Lafayette. He's feeding all this information to Lafayette, who takes it to Washington, and they're moving the army around to get ready for all the British stuff. And then Cornwallis, James Armistead's been so faithful to Cornwallis. Cornwallis says, I have a proposal. Would you be willing to be a spy for the British against the Americans? I mean, since you escaped as a slave from America. And so he ends up being a double spy. So what he does, he's already a spy against the British. Now the British think he's a spy against the Americans. So he's feeding the Americans all the great information. He's feeding the British all the wrong information.
Wow.
They end up getting Cornwallis trapped out on the peninsula at Yorktown, where they had the French Navy on one side, the American Army on the other, nowhere for the British to go. They're trapped. How'd that happen? James Armistead feeding them bad information.
That's awesome.
Do you know that black patriot? Literally, you can say that he probably cut years off the American Revolution.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent. Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s. What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith, and why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history